Hey, welcome back to Couch Talk. It's Eddie here. Sorry it's been so long. I have had a myriad of personal life issues, from health problems to financial emergencies to you name it. But I'm finally back in the saddle. I want to get back in the swing of things, and I hope that you haven't lost interest in me. Give me another shot. Today I want to talk about something I've been thinking about for a while, and that is the 2020 election, right? As many of you know, the 2020 election is an election that Trump and many of his followers, especially people on the right, claim is stolen, right? And that's a pretty nebulous word. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but we'll investigate it today. And of course, in the left, most of the people say that everyone who claims that is an election denier and that they're out of their minds, basically they're crazy, and that there is absolutely, quote unquote, no evidence of any fraud. So one of the things that strikes me about this first is that very phenomenon, that one side thinks almost entirely one thing and the other side thinks almost entirely something else. That phenomenon in and of itself is curious to me, because in the abstract, this is not really a partisan issue again, right? Like, again, whether or not the integrity of an election is maintained really has nothing to do with what side you're on. Although I do note that there is a propensity on the left to prefer access to security in an election, and on the right there's a propensity to prefer security to access. So there may be something there. But just kind of as a general rule of thumb, when we investigate these topics and you're out there, if you are in accord with everything that a single side says, and it's not like a abstract philosophical thing, it's just like a factual claim, chances are you're letting your bias influence you, right? And I'll say that for both sides here, right? Like, if you're a Republican and you're an election denier with all the other Republicans, you're probably in trouble, and you're probably doing it because you wanted a Republican to win a specific election. And if you're a Democrat and you're saying that all the elections are completely, wholly, 100% legitimate, it's probably because you're a Democrat and you wanted your Democrat guy to win. So again, it's like this bias exists on both sides. And meanwhile, I'm still here in the middle, and I'm like, what are you guys talking about? Both positions are reasonable. My position on this is, I think that fraud happened, but that it did not change the results of the election, right? In other words, I feel like if there were no fraud at all, Biden still would have won. Now, I know that some people are going to get really mad at me. Some people are going to get, I think that's probably like the worst answer, right? Like, I end up being in the middle. I end up being in a situation where everybody from every side hates me, because the people who are election deniers and are Republicans hate that I'm like, no, this didn't change anything. And the people who are in the left are like, what do you mean there's fraud? Like, I get the worst of both worlds usually when I take this middle stance. But I want to talk about this election and the anomalies that took place, because I don't think either position is crazy. I really don't. I think this is another situation where, just like so many other things in life, there are multiple reasonable assumptions. There are multiple rational ways to view this, and none of them are off the table, really. So let's talk about some of the anomalies that took place. One anomaly that took place during the 2020 election is the very first time that an incumbent president, gained in voter base, like had more votes than ever, and lost. First time ever in history. To me, that's not that big of a deal. To me. And the reason it's not that big of a deal is because part of that, I think, is automatic. Like, part of it, I think that there's more people in America than ever before. And politics is so charged right now, so there's a heavier active group of voters than ever before. So, like, the fact that you get that kind of record turnout, I think, is relatively normal. So to me, some of these anomalies are going to mean more and less, right? They're going to have different weights. But I also want to be clear that while any one of them is probably easily dismissible, after you have so many anomalies, you get to a point where it starts to kind of raise some eyebrows. And if you are in the group where your eyebrow can't be raised by seeing so many different anomalies, then you're just not paying attention. You're either just you're willingly ignoring it, right? So I don't want people to come away thinking that those who claim that there was widespread fraud here are just out of their minds. It is not a crazy position to have. It may not be what I believe, it may not be what you believe, but it's not like they're psycho. There are rational reasons for thinking this. So let's talk about another anomaly, right? 18 out of 19 bellwether counties, for the very first time ever, were wrong. 18 out of 19, right? There's 19 bellwether counties in America, and 18 of them were voting for Trump. 18 of them. Now, this anomaly means more to me than the anomaly prior, right? The one we just talked about. I'm not saying it's conclusive. I'm not, again, like I said, any one of these anomalies, you could probably just, like, if somebody came to me and this was the only problem, right? If this is the only thing, is like all the bellwether counties are wrong, I'd be like, okay, and that's kind of, and I'd still probably look at it and be like, that's kind of weird, but I wouldn't think much of it. But there is a reason we call them bellwether counties, right? There is a reason. And the reason for that is because they're usually right. They usually vote in accordance with the population. Now, again, by itself, this doesn't mean much because, trends can shift. Maybe they're no longer bellwether counties. It's worth noting that in 2016, a lot of bellwether counties were off also. Not nearly this many, but 2016 and 2020 were consecutively the record for bellwether counties being off, right? At least in recent times. So there's other constants there, like Trump, for example, is a constant. He was in both elections. Maybe there is something anomalous about Trump and his populism that could affect this sort of thing, right? There's a lot of anomalies with this election. But like I said, after you just keep on adding up these anomalies, it gets intriguingly more and more interesting, right? Like, for example, one anomaly is like late on election night, there's a lot of these swing states, battleground states, are, closing their polls. Trump is comfortably in a lead, right? And in several of these places, like the Observer, the independent observers were either removed or required to be socially distanced at this point while the counting continues. And then while this takes place, you get these huge batches of this extremely heavy slant in Biden's favor. Now, again, by itself, this really doesn't mean much, right? But it's just another little itty bitty thing to tack on. When the counting does resume, you get that kind of anomalous ratio. There's a lot of late ballots that were counted that aren't really typical. Like I think in Pennsylvania, there were like 23,000 ballots that were literally had impossible return dates, and another 80,000 or so that were so on the wire that they at least raised serious questions. Again, any one of these is like, no big deal. Right? Any one of them, any two of them, every 3 or 4 of them. But after I think I've got what do I have? 9, 10 odd things about the 2020 election. Definitely enough odd things to think that something was weird about the election. Not necessarily widespread fraud. Now, one of the things to investigate about this is, what does that even mean, widespread fraud? What does it mean for an election to be stolen? I would claim that a stolen election is that something took place to modify the result, right? And so the reason I don't believe that this election was stolen is because I think that the result would otherwise still have been Biden, right? Like, let's say, just for sake of argument, let's say that I don't believe that Pennsylvania and Georgia were two. I think maybe Georgia was stolen. Maybe. It's pretty close. Georgia was only like 13,000 votes off. Um, hell, one anomaly to consider, even in Georgia alone, the Matt Brainerd Voter Integrity Project estimates that there were 20,000 votes cast by non-residents, either non-residents or people who had the residency incorrect, right? So they either voted in the wrong place or they just weren't supposed to vote at all. So that alone would have overturned that state, right? So like, let's say you assume that the two close ones are Pennsylvania and Georgia, and they're really the only two that were really on the wire. Let's say you assume that they were taken. You still end up with Biden 270, Trump 268 for the total electoral vote count. So Biden still wins, right? It would be much, much closer. And it was a narrow margin. It really was a narrow margin. But even if you assume those two states shift, you still don't end up with a Trump presidency. So I'm not really sure where people get the idea that it's stolen. One thing to consider, though, is as I've asked people like my father this question, and this is something for the left to pay attention to, because I think they often argue disingenuously. They think that when Republicans say it was stolen, that they're saying it was all fraud. My father doesn't mean that, and I've talked to several other people who don't mean that. What they mean is there's some other things at play. Like, for example, there was a situation where the state allowed for late ballots to be counted, but it wasn't the ability to allow extra ballots to be counted late wasn't the power of the judiciary, and it was the judiciary that authorized it because of the pandemic. In reality, it was the state law required the legislature to make calls like that. And so it really shouldn't have happened, technically, by the rules, right? That doesn't mean that it was fraudulent, right? Those are two different things. But it is probably something that technically shouldn't have happened. My father has a big problem with ballot harvesting. I don't, right? Like, I don't, when it comes to ballot harvesting, I'm like, I look at my father and I'm like, it's legal in most states, He's like, well, not in all of them. I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. There are probably one or two that did some ballot harvesting where it wasn't supposed to happen. But for the ones that did it where it was supposed to happen, I'm like, that's just dumb on Republicans for not doing it, right? Why didn't they do it? I think it's silly to whine about somebody doing something within the rules, framework that makes sense, that helps you. Like, why wouldn't you do that? I think it's just smart. So I don't know. But I just keep that in the back of your mind. When people say it's stolen, they don't necessarily mean it's fraudulent. Sometimes they just mean there are other things at play, like kind of underhanded ways of doing things that, while they may not be illegal or fraudulent, they kind of just exist outside of our societal norm. And they're, that's a fair enough accusation, I guess. There are lots of failures to match signatures in mail-in ballots. There's some destruction of envelopes that were required to contain signatures. There was a historically low absentee ballot rejection percentage, right? Like, lowest ever. And if I read one guy that was analyzing this mathematically, had they done exactly the same percentage of absentee ballot rejection as in the past 5 voting cycles, then Trump wins, right? But again, right, like any one of these, it's kind of, independence just doesn't really mean anything. But one thing I do want to address, though, is the counter accusation that there is no evidence indicating fraud, I think is a false statement. At least it's misleading, right? Because to have a sequence of anomalies is evidence. It's not good evidence. It's what I would call circumstantial evidence, right? Here's a piece of real evidence, right? One thing that you can go, and I'll link it below. You guys can go check it out, and I encourage you to. There was a study done, a peer-reviewed scientific study, a mathematical analysis of some of the voting patterns in the districts specifically that were accused of fraud, right? In many of the cases, what they found was overall there were 255,000 quote-unquote excess votes. And what they mean by that, there were votes that were cast in favor of Biden that are a huge statistical anomaly, right? And again, by itself, this doesn't mean very much, but you add it to the layer of complexity of the rest of these anomalies, and this is a very concrete mathematical analysis of what these voters typically vote, how they typically organize themselves. And in many of these districts that they analyzed, you're talking about like a district where the divide is like in the middle of a neighborhood, right? When literally everything in both sides of that district are essentially the same. The demographic is the same, the racial composition is the same, the gender composition is the same, the voter registration composition is the same. The only thing that changes is like you walk across the street, and the only thing that changes is the logistics. The only thing that changes is where the votes are counted. Now that's a particularly intriguing inquiry, right? Because it shows basically from a district by district perspective that there's an anomaly available, right? Again, by itself, any one of these is probably easily dismissible. But to say that there isn't evidence is factually false, right? There is evidence to indicate that at least something really weird happened. Something really weird happened. Like, so weird that it has never happened before. We had, I think, 11 firsts, 11 records for voting. And again, that doesn't prove fraud. It doesn't. But part of what I think constitutes a rational fear, and we should consider this too, right? Part of what constitutes rational fear are the stakes involved, right? So let's say, for example, you're thinking about COVID, for example, right? And now, I know that the odds of me going outside and catching COVID, especially now, are relatively low. Relatively low, right? And even if I do catch it, the odds thereafter of me catching a serious version of the disease at my age and health, even lower. But what are the stakes if I'm wrong, right? What are the stakes involved if I am incorrect? Then my children lose a father, Like the stakes are so high that even a small percentage chance makes the fear a rational one to an extent, right? And I'm not saying that in this particular situation I'm afraid of COVID, right? That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is when the stakes go up, the proportion that you need for the fear to be rational is smaller, right? Now, I don't know what it means to have widespread fraud. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means like the fraud is literally spread out to different corners of the nation, like the word implies in English. I think it would be odd to have fraud, centered all in one district. One thing that I think is a factually true statement is that there is fraud in every presidential election that we've ever held in America, right? And I think that's common ground, right? I don't think anybody's arguing that fraud doesn't exist. For those of you who are, post your comments below. I just don't think that that's something that someone could find as a defensible position. I think we know fraud exists. Now, how much, right? So then the question is to what degree, right? To what degree is an acceptable level of fraud? I heard one figure was 0.25%. That's what people estimate our fraudulent voting to be. 0.25% of the vote is fraudulent. Now, that's still a very large number of people. Larger, in fact, than the margin by which Biden won. Now, in theory, right, that could be enough to overturn the election. Now, one of the problems, though, is that some of the fraud goes the opposite direction, right? But I note that out of all these anomalies I just mentioned, every single one of them seems to have benefited Biden. Every single one of them. So that's kind of an awkward, right? Like it's one thing if, one of them helps Trump and one of them helps Biden and one of them helps Trump and then Biden and then Trump, but it's like Biden. So I'm like, ugh. Right? Like this is not that crazy, right? And with the stakes being so high, if you truly tell me that with the stakes being so high as to realize that you may be staring down the end of your political philosophies ever taking hold again, right? If you're staring down the possibility that your voice truly never matters again because the outcome of the presidential elections can just be orchestrated, those stakes are so high that I don't think literally any fear is irrational at that point. Like literally, if you could prove, and I don't know how it would be profitable to prove that fraud is only a certain level. I mean, how do we know what we don't know, right? But even if you could prove that it was only 0.1%, I think that would still be a rational fear. I think it would still be reasonable to worry about the security of an election. Does that mean that I think it should outweigh all of the other facets of an election, right? Like convenience or ease or making sure everybody's voice is heard? No, I do not. I do not think that. But again, I just don't think either position is unreasonable. And it bothers me when the left dismisses the right as though they are crazy because they have that fear. Because they have that fear of the integrity of an election being defiled. One of the interesting things that took place during the election was that there was a couple of cases where observers for the ballot counting were raised complaints, and then the Trump took that complaint to court, and it was kind of intriguing because it was it was overturned and then sustained and then overturned again, right? So like they went to different levels of court, and essentially the outcome was that the judge indicated that both interpretations were correct or reasonable, right? And so the law really is ambiguous. Basically what the law says is that the observers are allowed to be present, but the assumption that they are to be present to observe isn't specifically stated in the law, which is really ironic. Like, it's kind of a weird oversight. I don't know why you would even have an observer if they can't observe, but due to the pandemic, for many of the locations, they kind of distanced the observers from the actual counting of the ballots so that they couldn't actually check the counting of the ballots. And again, I don't think by itself does that prove fraud. No. But it is kind of weird that they couldn't observe. And then the odd thing is that when they challenged this to try to get the observers to be able to be closer, it was contested. That's the odd thing, I think. So who goes to fight against that? That's my question. My question is, let's say you're a person who wants to observe more closely. You form a complaint, and then it goes to court. And then instead of just saying, oh, God, yeah, you want to be closer? All right, fine, go ahead. Even if you felt like that wasn't entitled to them by the law, like even if you felt like the law was in fact ambiguous and it didn't actually entitle them, an observer, to observe, you still wouldn't fight it unless you were trying to hide something, or basically just trying to force your agenda through because you figure you had already won, right? Like, there's really no reason to contest that, except if you want to try to keep people from observing the election. So that's just kind of a weird, just so many little anomalies in this election that really didn't take place in any prior election. But again, like I said, I don't personally believe that this changed the results of the election, but I do think it was intriguing enough that any of these positions I think they're all on the table, right? Remember that in order for a claim to be a reasonable one, it doesn't have to necessarily convince you personally, right? Like, I'm I'm a conservative, but I don't think the liberal claim is an unreasonable one. I just think it's just not the most for me. Like it doesn't convince me personally. But I don't think that like it's not like I look at liberals like they're crazy. But I do see many Republicans that do, right? I do see many Democrats that look at Republicans like they're crazy, like that's a categorical failure. We need to start entreating with each other as though we can put ourselves in each other's shoes. We need to start entreating with each other as though each of us has something valid to contribute to the conversation, to participate in this social change, right? That's all I got for you guys today. Tell me what you think below. I just think that I see this tennis match going back and forth with, oh, you're an election denier, or oh, this election was fraudulent, and it's back and forth, and everybody seems to think that the other side is crazy. And meanwhile, I can understand both positions very reasonably. I think that it's perfectly normal to assume that there was fraud in the election. Perfectly normal to assume that that fraud may have had a large effect on the result. I don't think it was enough, but that's just me personally. And I would never dream of looking at somebody and telling them, one, that there's no evidence, because there is. There is evidence. It may not be the best evidence in the world. It may not be the evidence that is needed to convince you, but there is evidence that this was a weird election, that weird stuff happened. Two, I would never look at them and tell them they're crazy or that they're an election denier categorically because they challenged a single election, right? Like, this is really the first election that we've really challenged as a nation. And I think that doesn't bode well for us, but even so, it's still just the first time, and it was kind of under really awkward circumstances. So hopefully we can avoid those circumstances in the future, and I'm open to suggestions on how to do that. I'll catch you guys next time on Couch Talk.